How have Pokemon designs evolved over time? It's a worthy question, and one I think you can explore through many aspects, through the context of starters, legendaries, or the entire decks. But today, I want to focus on something in between. Just entire types and how their designs have evolved over time, to see if these stories of different types are the same or distinct from one another. Meaning, do all Pokemon types follow a linear progression, from vague concepts and realistic animals in Generation 1, to highly saturated and heavily conceptual designs in Generation 9? Well, let's figure that out, because it's a little more complicated. The history of each type seems to offer some twists and some turns of its own. Today we'll be studying the 3 starter types of Grass, Fire, and Water. But keep in mind we'll be considering every single Pokemon introduced in that generation as part of our study, not just the starters, but we will, for the sake of brevity, be solely featuring the final evolutions as our main case studies, because I think figuring out where Pokemon designs end up in their final forms is far more important than what happens along the way. I've resumed work putting together a Fakemon region of my own behind the scenes, and I do consider studying existing Pokemon a paramount exercise in Fakemon design. So today will be a great exercise in that. Also be sure to check out my community Discord, where you can get behind the scenes previews on some of these Fakemon, characters, and more, that I hope to formally unveil in due time. It will be well worth the wait. With that shameless plug out of the way, let's jump right into it. Let's start off with the Generation 1 Grass types, which is actually a pretty numerically small and conceptually limited pool. In no small part because 3 out of the 5 lines here are Grass Poison type. We get many designs that are much more tied to the idea that plants are poisonous or dangerous. The bright red on many of them implies a message of get away and do not eat, similar to real-life poisonous plants or animals. We also have the classic Generation 1 trope at work here of most, if not all of these designs being vague animals or outright sentient plants, but again no clear inspirations as to what that plant is, just a nondescript palm frond, mushroom, or set of vines. Victory Bell's pitcher plant is the closest we get to specificity. We see that these designs rely on evoking a feeling of danger and power more so than delving into specific origins and drawing specific powers from those origins. Lastly, another thing that I think is a product of the generation is the fact that none of these are really environment specific. They all seem like they vaguely thrive in humid, dense tropical areas, which is odd for Kanto, but I think this is worth keeping an eye on specifically for grass types to see if they ever come to depict or represent an intended environment for the region that they're found in. Generation 1 fire types follow suit with minimal designs of their own, being surprisingly more restrained with the use of fire than I remember. Pokemon like Charizard and Magmar have only a small tuft of fire on their tails, with Pokemon like Rapidash and Moltres having a bit more on display, but it's strangely disconnected from their bodies, meaning it's a literal flame placed on or around their bodies, with the body itself being a monochromatic kind of element and not having any integration to the flame itself. It's all or nothing. If you took the flame away, there would be little to no tell that these Pokemon are fire type beyond their coloration, which always has a murky tan or orange. Only Magmar and Arcanine play around with that idea of body patterning to provide both contrast and integration to the flame theme, especially Magmar, who has gold and red flame patterns on the body that actually integrate seamlessly into the flame tail, rather than have it be superimposed on top of the body. Now this massive pool of Generation 1 water types has the clear affordance that there are many types of real-world animals that inhabit the water, and this group demonstrates that by including mollusk, fish, arthropods, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and even mammals into the bunch. I assume this was an intentional decision, given that this was the first generation, and they wanted Pokemon available to inhabit a wide variety of environmental niches. You'll also immediately notice that unlike grass or fire types, who incorporate literal pieces of the elements into their anatomies, foliage, or open flames respectively, we don't see many water types with rendered water on their bodies. Instead, their typing is a bit more subtle than the other two and implied either through their coloration or their body types. Another product of Generation 1 realism is that their bodies go to the great length to show detailed fins, shells, or webbing, to showcase how they would survive in the water. The concept for many of these Pokemon just seems to be survival in the open ocean, or by the shore, and puts that physiological realism first, even with designs that do supposedly delve into mythological or fantastical origins like Gyarados and Lapras. This might be the most realistic group of Pokemon that we will explore today, but we'll see. Now we move on to the second generation of Pokemon, where we notice an immediate evolution for our grass types at least. All 5 of these lines are meant to be a lot cuter and friendlier than our Generation 1 bunch, with brighter, perhaps more feminine features and color palettes. This makes it so they kind of fall on the opposite end of the spectrum as to how we view their theming and habitats. Looking at them evokes fragrant scents, gentle breezes, vibrant flowers, and the beauty of nature rather than the dark, aggressive, toxic, and unknowable forces of the wild. However, just like Generation 1, they're still a bit vague. The floral elements of their bodies either are their whole bodies or they're functioning like Generation 1, just decoration to code the typing and a little more, like a flower around the neck of a plain body. Only Blossom gives us a hint as to what we can expect in the future, with its flowers not only serving to showcase the typing, but also have dual meaning as a Polynesian grass skirt and headdress. Fire types here are almost the opposite end of the spectrum from grass, with all of these designs being incredibly complex, at least in their shape language, since the concepts and colors do remain pretty plain in these early generations. However, even if these designs only have 2 or 3 colors each, they are still much more varied than their Generation 1 counterparts, with other essences of fire being showcased beyond the orange and tan flames that we saw before. Now we have the darkened black of soot, the cooled gray of magma, and the dazzling contrast of red, green, and white, to showcase dancing flames of various temperatures. Only Typhlosion doesn't move on from the Generation 1 trend of desaturated colors, with a literal flame disconnected physiologically from the body. And for Generation 2 water types, we have a pool that follows the trend of grass, with more saturated colors and more simplified shapes to make the Pokemon look overall cuter and less intimidating. Rather than having realistic animals all in the shade of blue that seem to have sharp and powerful features that cut through water, these Pokemon look to be more mellow, like they have buoyant or graceful features that allow them to bob gently in water and float. And while we don't have literal water on their bodies, we see the first pictorial representations of water here, with Suicune's ice crystal markings and Azumaril's bubble patterns on the belly. It's through this that the type is communicated beyond the color, or anatomy. Especially necessary since, unlike Generation 1, this isn't a homogeneous pool of Pokemon based on animals that necessarily live in the water. We have a leopard and a rabbit, for crying out loud. Now we move on to Generation 3, which is honestly far less of a visual departure than I immediately remember, given how radical many other parts of this generation were. The first and most obvious departure is a bit deeper. Now it's the majority expectation that Pokemon draw from 2 or more origins in their designs. Nowhere in this batch is a plain old sentient grass monster. A Pokemon like Cacturne is not only a cactus, but also evokes a scarecrow or an outlaw. Now we fully see what I was talking about with Blossom in the majority of Pokemon. The use of foliage isn't just an accessory to showcase the literal elements at hand, but now has much more fantastical shapes and inclusions, often to denote clothing. We see Shiftry, the Tengu, with its wooden clog stilts, extending from its wooden body, Ludicolo with a lily pad sombrero, and Cacturne, of course, with a western hat. Of course, this isn't true for every design. Pokemon like Sceptile, Roselia, and Cradily absolutely fit in with Generation 2 in my book. They're a bit simpler and the floral elements are straightforward. However, these Pokemon do once again return to the more dangerous and tropical look of Generation 1 grass types, which I believe is the first time we see this done for a reason, which is to fit into the very ecologically diverse Hoenn region with its deserts, deep seas, and especially lush forests, with almost every representation of grass or foliage looking sharp and sleek, just like real-life tropical plants. This makes it so these Pokemon don't have grass as a mere covering, but the individual blade-like leaves look more like armor or weapons, adorning the Pokemon and making it look more dynamic and battle-ready. Generation 3 fire types are a very small pool. That really underscores how rare fire types are compared to these other 2 types. I noticed this a few times, when generations had a far smaller pool of fire types than I remembered them having, but I digress. These designs are far less complex than Generation 2 or even 1 designs, in the sense that none of them incorporate open flames, but at least 2 of them, Blaziken and Camerupt, can ignite into flames situationally, as flaming cuffs in battle or when erupting volcanically, respectively. Because of this, simplicity arises because these designs leave room for these flames or fire-like elements to emerge occasionally, but are not ever present. Even Torkoal is a very simple design when you remove the smoke. These designs instead showcase their element through bright colors, to give you the sense that rather than prolifically spewing or producing flames, these Pokemon are built to withstand or embody heat as a whole, be it kinetic energy, the sun, or smoke and steam. Another evolution because now we see dimensionality as to what fire can be or represent beyond literal fire. Now the water types here are a perfect blend of generations 1 and 2. Similar to Generation 1, these Pokemon are entirely based on aquatic undersea animals. This time, I believe that is more so a product of the trend that we found with the grass types here, fitting into the region, Hoenn, quite well. But just like Generation 2, these Pokemon forego shape complexity in most cases to have simpler, rounder features, and instead incorporate warm colors and other patterns to provide complexity and contrast. Compare a Pokemon like Crawdaunt to Kingler, whereas the complexity with Kingler comes from its jagged, realistic proportions and many spikes. Crawdaunt has a sleeker body that gets its visual complexity through the multicolored stripes and segments that are painted atop it. This goes for many Pokemon here, like Huntail, who doesn't even have front fins, yet gets its complexity through round, multicolored markings and smooth ridges along the back to give it contrast. For the first time as well, we also see what we saw with grass types, in that designs incorporate multiple points of origin and thus have layered designs beyond animal whose concept it is to look aquatic with realistic aquatic features and colors. No, we have Walreign's seafoam beard, Gorbis's seashell bra, and again, Ludicolo's lily pad sombrero. We see that by the end of Generation 3, we have fully leaned into the trend of elemental features being used unconventionally to reinforce the secondary concept, since it is safe to say that by now, almost all Pokemon have hybridized concepts. Now onto Generation 4, beginning of course with the grass types. The DS era gave us bigger screens and thus slightly more room, physically, to iterate on these sprites. So a lot of these designs look a lot bulkier, and thus have a lot more room on the body to showcase small details, like Wormadam's flowers or the spots that Carnivine has on the top of its head. I do not believe that these would have been possible in the Game Boy era. We also see that foliage is now depicted beyond individual blades or leaves, like they were in Generation 3. Here we now have detailed clumps of grassy elements like bushes and masses of vines that imply dozens, if not hundreds of individual strands, rather than the relatively smooth and sleek designs we had in earlier generations. Even places that I think earlier generations would have ended in a single point now have lots of smaller details, like the gradient and wrinkles on Leafeon's tail or Carnivine's arms, splitting into 3 points rather than just being a single blade. And finally, we are fully in the territory, especially for grass types, that each generation must have a variety of habitats or niches on display. We have grass types meant for sunny meadows, alpine mountains, and forests in between. Generation 4 fire types are a bit less complex than the prior generation, an emerging pattern that I do see for this type. We see through Infernape's hair, whereas in prior generations it would have been a billowing mane with dozens of sharp points. It now tapers into sleek 2 or 3 point flame that is meant to represent something beyond fire, in this case hair, a trend we found with the other tube types in the last generation. However, something brand new here is the emergence of contrast. Whereas only 1 or 2 designs from prior pools showcase this, now every single fire type has a much lighter or much darker color introduced on the body to play off the warm fire tones. In many cases, this color is a dark black or gray. A last detail that I noticed is that each non-fire element on its body, namely the tufts of fur, are deliberately made to look like fire at all times. This is a level of intentionality that is new so far. In prior generations, fully evolved complex Pokemon could have tufts of fur and it didn't have to resemble or fit into their typing. They could just be jagged and wild for the sake of random complexity. But here we see exaggerated and fantastical evocations of fire, like Magmortar's wispy shoulder blades and Infernape's swirly gold wrist pads. For Generation 4 water types, we see a big departure, at least conceptually. Many of these designs are amphibious, not outright aquatic Pokemon. It seems that by this point, Pokemon had exhausted all they needed fish and undersea staples like starfish and crabs. Now water types are free to live by the sea majoritarily, not necessarily in it. Just like Generation 2 and 3, Generation 4 further iterates by having each Pokemon display a contrast of warm and cool colors. It's not just swaths of blue, but instead blue accents on an orange body, or red dots on a blue body. The biggest thing to note is the full inclusion for the first time of secondary concepts. Water was certainly the last type to embrace this, as it relied mostly on just aquatic life as a theme. or just vague hints, like Sharpedo being a dark-type bully, but mainly just a shark. Now in Generation 4, almost every Pokemon, except for Lumineon maybe, showcases a secondary theme through visual elements with double meanings, just like the grass types that we discussed. Floatzel has life jacket fins, and Empoleon has penguin feathers resembling a French coat. This is a point where water types, while still being the biggest type, slows down a tad and introduces smaller pools of Pokemon with richer concepts, rather than just filling out every aquatic niche in the book. Generation 5 is here, and I don't think there's a single thing to be said that hasn't already been said. This seems to be the most hotly debated generation of Pokemon design philosophy to this day. However, what is most obvious certainly rings true. This was widely seen as a reset, a return to Generation 1 ideals of simplicity, but now with much more fantastical shape language, coloration, and in some instances, concepts. We can see this with Pokemon like Maractus, Whimsicott, and Ferroseed, who all have relatively plain body concepts, either being a Generation 1 style animal with distinct plant elements solely as a covering or a sentient plant, but now with Generation 5's high degrees of saturation and simplicity. Here the foliage elements are implied rather than explicitly drawn in many cases. Comparing the bush on Summer Sawsbuck's head to the detailed and shaded tree on Torterra's back is night and day. However, we do get those small details that I pointed out from Generation 4. Many of these Pokemon like Amoonguss, Ferrothorn, and Lilligant have tiny dot markings on their bodies to showcase their texture, since room for that detail is now possible firmly in the DS era. But for the other half of Pokemon, we see a clear continuation of that secondary concept theme that I mentioned that began all the way in Generation 3. Lilligant, Simisage, and Serperior all use foliage in ways that largely forego botanical realism entirely, and are meant to look solely like elements of clothing in some way, showcasing how the grass type and its elemental powers are secondary to another concept or inspiration. The fire types are an interesting bunch as well, ramping up that theme of contrast that I mentioned in Generation 4 to an extreme. The pattern on Heatmor and Emboar's chest, all of Chandelure, and even the black markings on Volcarona are far more striking than any Pokemon we've seen before today. We also begin to see a difference in how fire is portrayed, continuing on what we saw with Infernape's distinct head flame. It used to be that either a Pokemon had no fire on its body or a generic flame billowing out. But in Generation 5, fire types that have fire each have a completely unique style in how it's portrayed. Heatmor's is simply an accent to a design that features much more prominent elements, so the fire is minimal. Darmanitan enhances the personality by having the fire solely serve as eyebrows, and less so as a living flame. And Emboar has a dash of the traditional fire rendering that we're used to, but it serves mainly to look like a clothing accent, continuing what I mentioned about elements coming second to higher concepts. And for the water types, we see a return to Generation 2 and 3 sensibilities. More realistic and straightforward sea creatures in terms of concept, but with cartoonishly rounded shapes that we often saw in Generations 2 and 3, in lieu of jagged or sharp shapes. This is the through line for all Generation 5 designs, providing a level of deliberate exaggeration, and a firm transition into an era where every single Pokemon is given a distinct and memorable silhouette or proportions. However, we see the fewest number of colors used since Generation 1, with most of these designs having predominantly cold tones of blue with a muted black or white accent. Perhaps this was meant to allude to Generation 1, as I mentioned, and provide some degree of simplicity. But now we move on to the 3D era with Generation 6, which I believe allowed for a very distinct transformation due to the nature of 3D models. The grass types show an incredible transformation with a pool of very complex designs. Whereas Generation 5 was smooth and cartoonish, these designs feature detailed lines, shapes, and angles. The hair on Gourgeist, the tree on Trevenant, and even the horns on Gogoat have many twists and turns that make these silhouettes far more complicated than the prior generation, and almost like a return to Generation 4. What I mentioned about whole bushes being showcased rather than individual leaf blades. This is also compounded by Mega Evolution, who by design are meant to be very complex with the number of individual details they showcase. These factors, along with the more muted and earthy brown tones present, make this pool of relatively realistic Pokemon fitting for the Kalos region, a relatively cold and temperate area. Fire types continue this complexity, with a new design philosophy for this type that now has much more wavy shapes, in lieu of the typically sharp and pointy look of fire or fur. I should note that outside of Mega Charizard X and Blaziken, who are both Mega designs, there is no regular Pokemon here with literal fire on its body, which is a first for any generation. Now each Pokemon has complex fire markings on its body, continuing that idea of extreme contrast from Generation 5, all of which want to suggest fire rather than depict it. Compare something like Talonflame and its billowing flame feathers with Moltres, who has just flames on its back, and yet how they both look distinctly like fire types in different ways, yet one is much more complex than the other. It's here that we also notice that Generation 6 Pokemon have far less variance in their personalities than Generation 5 designs, which often had exaggerated proportions and an uncanny resemblance to Generation 1 tropes to come off as aloof and foreign. Here, Generation 6 designs are meant to be seen as hardcore, tough, and fierce. Again, a pattern exacerbated by so many Mega designs. This absolutely continues with the Water Bunch, in both the level of complexity and the intense personalities. All of these Pokemon return to Generation 1 levels of segmentation and sharpness to suggest a resilient way of cutting through the water at extreme speeds or force. However, we do get a pivot when we reach Generation 7, which I believe largely returns to Generation 3 and 5 standards of providing more exaggerated designs that are aloof in personality, using varied facial expressions to convey different personalities. You'll also notice perhaps the single most interesting use of color in the whole franchise so far, with not a single muted design and instead each one having a high contrast between warm and cold tones. This is perhaps meant to allude to Alola's tropical and foreign nature compared to other regions, rather than imply anything about the nature of the grass type's fierceness or toxicity like Generation 3 or 1. However, we see a continuation of the bodily complexity of Generations 4 and 6, with each design being relatively proportionate, with smaller eyes, highly segmented, tiny details that exceed anything from the first 3 generations, and even their legendary Pokemon. Never before have we gotten the candy stripes on Lurantis or the tiny triangles on Tapu Bulu's helmet. The fire Pokemon continue their theme of providing extreme contrast, turning back to Generation 5's emphasis on black against red. All Pokemon except Blacephalon here have this, and even that Pokemon has some contrast of its own in its own way just due to the stark white. It's by this point that you'll notice that we are firmly past the territory of Pokemon being able to just be element and animal hybridized. Every single Pokemon, especially here in Alola, has a rich tapestry of origins, spanning mythology, folklore, the ecology of Hawaii, all before the element. All of those elemental features are now solely used to convey the Pokemon's niche, personality, or gimmick, rather than just display the straightforward power of the element itself. The only place Incineroar has fire, for example, is its wrestling belt, and Salazzle only has restrained yet memorably feminine pink fire markings on its chest to showcase its role as the matriarch of the Salandit population, and its unique gender ratio. The water Pokemon here continue that idea from the other 2 types here, and are extremely specific in their origins, fitting perfectly into the Polynesian world of Alola. This grouping is otherwise very hard to kind of generalize, as it's extremely diverse in terms of visual complexity, colors, personality types, and shapes. I'd say this is one of the most diverse groups of water types that draws from and celebrates all era of Pokemon designs thus far, with the complex and realistic shapes of Generations 4 and 6, the blue colors of Generations 1 and 5, and of course a level of detail that would only be possible in the 3D era. Now the Generation 8 Pokemon are interesting in the fact that we get another reset in a sense, with many designs that got very complex over the years reverting to something a bit simpler. Rillaboom, for a final evolution starter, has relatively homogeneous colors, only 2 prominent ones with minimal accents of orange and gray, so it kind of fits into Generations 2 or 3 in my opinion. A lot of people say it looks like a Generation 1 design, but the hair vines look more like hair than vines in my book. There's no tiny dots, markings, or anything to make the hair leaf look complex, however. Same with Zarude, who has very minimal vine cuffs over a predominantly black body. However, other Pokemon have exaggerated features that remind me of the deliberate angularity and memorable shapes that each Pokemon has had since Generations 4 or 5. In my opinion, these designs, while sometimes simple, do look like the least wild grass types we've ever had. All of their foliage features look somewhat like artificial or humanoid elements. Appleton is a whole-baked pie, Lilligant's petals are always in service of the ballet motif, Eldegoss and Rillaboom have hairdos, and Electrode looks like a whole-shaved ball. Oh, okay, that sounded wrong. Electrode looks polished and precise, like fine man-made woodwork. Gone are the days of feral-looking, jungle-inhabiting, sentient plants. The, again, very small pool of fire types looks more like a complete reversion to Generation 2 or 4, for me at least. The designs feature complex details, like the heat gradients on Colossal's body, or the fine markings on Arcanine and Centiskorch, but these elements are there to provide detail, not bold and striking contrast. Each of these Pokemon, except maybe Cinderace, are all very plain in terms of color as well, if not a bit desaturated. They remind me of the single tones predominantly used on Generation 1 or 2 designs, with each of these Pokemon also looking a bit monstrous and feral rather than being driven by intelligence or a complex secondary origin. Again, except maybe Cinderace, who is perhaps the most humanoid starter, but that's another discussion entirely. The water types, however, give us one of the most diverse pools ever, drawing once again from all generations. We have the rich and exaggerated concepts of the fossil abominations, the relatively simple colors and animal-like nature of Cramorant, concepts that fit in well with Generation 4 designs by virtue of having relatively complex animalistic anatomies hybridized perfectly with a secondary concept like Samurott, Barraskewda, and Basculegion, and even designs like Inteleon and Dreadnought, which honestly feel very Generation 4 to me because of the saturated colors and exaggerated, almost artificial shapes. Dreadnought is interesting in particular because its blocky head and uncanny eye look very Generation 5 to me, while its shell is rocky and realistic in a way that evokes Generation 1. All in all, a very diverse grouping. And here we are at the end, with the most recent Generation 9. This is perhaps impossible to categorize, since this generation is very segmented. There is a pool of regular Pokemon, but the other third to half of the dex is regional fakes, paradox Pokemon, regional forms, or Pokemon meant to look foreign, from Kitakami or the Blueberry Academy. However, we see something very unique here across the board, in that the games are advanced enough that nearly every single new Pokemon from now on seems to be created with some sort of, quote, gimmick in mind, be it a form change, a signature move or ability, or an evolution method. So often their designs seem to be led by that idea rather than a straightforward foliage covering giving it its identity. Ogerpon has a very detailed and artificial mask that is used primarily to obscure its identity and change its type. Its role as a grass type is entirely second to that concept. Same with Iron Leaves, who has some metallic grass features that bear little resemblance to real foliage, since its role as a futuristic paradox robot comes before any grass powers that it might have. Fire types are similar, with no real fire meant to look solely like fire on display besides Skeledirge, which feels like the most retro design here, and it would be at home in the complex Generation 4 or 6. Besides Scovillain, all of these designs, Skeledirge included, all incorporate minuscule details that are unprecedented for Pokemon. It reminds me of Generation 7 in that way. The patterning on the two knights, the tiny streaks of red on Blazebreed Tauros, the markings on Chiyu's tail, they all look like patterns meant to give the Pokemon a level of detail and sophistication, not necessarily meant to allude to or suggest literal fire. And finally, the water types are once again all over the place. Some designs like Dodonzo, Quaquaval, and Walking Wake all rely on water-like body patterns and seem sufficiently complex enough for Generations 3 or 4, while the Sushi Fish, Wugtrio, and even Finizen all have more rounded shapes and bright colors in place of complexity that look more like Generations 2 and 3 to me. What's more interesting is that this cements the pattern established in Generation 8, with a huge variety in concept, so it isn't just straightforward sea creatures, and instead a much more subversive mix of designs that play around with the concept of what it means to be a literal water type. Tauros and Iron Bundle are non-aquatic creatures that have adapted to living in the water or using water powers. Tatsugiri and Finizen are, but seem to live and move primarily above the water or on dry land. And with that, we have gone through the pool of grass, fire, and water types for each and every generation. Based on my observations alone, I saw the transformation of grass types from sentient tropical plant monsters to layered and varied designs that put their secondary concepts first. Fire types from plain animals with an open flame on their tail or back, to high contrast, intense personality designs that embody heat more so internally than externally, using fire as a rare accent rather than an expectation. And water types from cool-toned, semi-realistic underwater creatures to a very diverse group of designs that either may live in water or use water in some unexpected way. But would you agree with these characterizations? What do you think? And what generation has your favorite grouping of grass, fire, water types, and why? Let me know down below. Thank you so much to every single person who supports this channel. Videos like this, and of course long-form projects that are shaping up to be very exciting. Especially my guardian patron and Wynne. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time for more content.